Well, I think we're ready to go. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome. My name is Arthur Urbano. I teach in the theology department and am chair of the theology department's Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. And I welcome all of you here this evening for the annual Spring Dialogue that is part of our Providence College Lecture and Colloquium Series, Theological Exchange Between Catholics and Jews. Now in its sixth year, the series seeks to promote interreligious understanding and dialogue by focusing on themes of mutual religious and theological interest in the Catholic and Jewish traditions. In short, we see this as an opportunity for Catholics and Jews to learn about and from one another. It is always nice to see so many of our students, faculty, and staff here on an annual basis. And I would like to extend an especially warm welcome to those of you who are visiting from local synagogues and churches. Thank you for being here with us this evening. Tonight's dialogue marks the first in a three-year series that commemorates the 50th anniversary of the groundbreaking document Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions issued by the Second Vatican Council in October of 1965. In this document, the Council Fathers articulated a new vision of the Catholic Church's relationship to Judaism, Islam, and other world religions, and officially opened the door to interreligious dialogue. It was especially significant for the relationship between the Church and Judaism. It affirmed the Jewish roots of Christianity and the enduring covenant relationship between God and Israel. It condemned anti-Semitism and encouraged collaboration and dialogue between Christians and Jews. In this first year of the series, we focus on the state of the Jewish-Catholic relationship prior to Vatican II and the key figures who contributed to the movement which led to Nostra Aetate. Next year, the focus will be on Nostra Aetate itself, its theology, its significance, and its implementation. In the third year, which also coincides with the centennial of Providence College, we will ask the questions, where are Jewish-Catholic relations now, and where are we going, both locally and globally? And I'm very happy to announce this evening that our featured speaker in this third year will be Cardinal Timothy Dolan, Archbishop of New York, and co-chair of the National Jewish Catholic Dialogue here in the U.S. His Eminence will be here at Providence College in November of 2016, so a year and a half from now. But mark your calendars now. It'll likely be a big event. So. Before I introduce tonight's topic and speakers, an acknowledgement of thanks is due to those who make these events possible. First and foremost, to our donors, among these the Diocese of Providence, Edward and Barbara Feldstein, Leo Magavero, Arthur Robbins, Faye Rozovsky, James Winokur, and other alumni and friends of the college, both Jews and Catholics. Your support and generosity keep this endeavor alive. I'd like to also thank the co-sponsors of today's events, the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies, Father Gabriel and Margaret Wakely, the Office of Institutional Diversity, the Graduate Program in Theology, the History Department, and the Development of Western, the Development of Western, you'd think I taught the class enough times, you'd think I'd be able to pronounce it. The Development of Western Civilization Program, DWC. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee for their commitment, hard work, and enthusiasm. Recent events in Belgium, France, Sweden, and other parts of Europe have demonstrated that anti-Semitism is still alive and well, and, what must give us great pause, it is seeing a resurgence. Europe's Jewish population faces a great crisis. As French Prime Minister Manuel Valls stated that France will no longer be France without French Jews, a recent Atlantic article posed the question, is it time for the Jews to leave Europe? Pope Francis, echoing the sentiments of his immediate predecessors, has reminded Catholics that anti-Semitism is a sin. A Christian cannot be anti-Semitic, he has said. Tonight our guests will speak about the nature of anti-Semitism, from Catholic and Jewish perspectives, and the climate in Europe that both culminated in the horrific tragedy of the Holocaust and paved the way for Nostra Aetate. John Connolly is professor of history at the University of California at Berkeley. He received his doctorate from Harvard. He's an expert in modern East and Central European political and social history, comparative education, history of nationalism and racism, and the history of Catholicism. His 2012 book, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, was awarded the John Gilmary Shea Book Prize of the American Catholic Historical Association. Michael Zank, to my immediate left, is professor of religion at Boston University and director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies. He received his PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University and also has training in Protestant theology and Jewish-Christian relations. His expertise is in German-Jewish intellectual history, including Hermann Cohen, Martin Buber, and Leo Strauss. He has 2 works in progress, A Brief History of Jerusalem and a study in German of Jewish philosophy of religion. So the format of tonight's event will be that each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes. And then after that, they'll have some time to speak with one another and respond to one another's presentation, at which point we will then open up the discussion for questions. And there are microphones, yes, here and here. So we invite your participation as well. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Michael Zank.
That's right. Good evening. Thank you for having us. I'm very pleased, I'm very honored to be here as one of the speakers for the 3-year cycle of considering Nostra Aetate and what it means to Christian-Jewish relations, especially Catholic-Jewish relations today. So I have made new friends today. There's John Conley, who I had never met before, so we already had a conversation this morning. We had lunch together, and I'm looking forward to our exchange later. And of course, Arthur Urbano, who is our host, who was driving us, and then there was Frank, who drove us earlier, and Father Gabriel. I also met earlier, and I realized, and I asked him what his job was here at the college, and says he has to make sure that people who speak here on the college are kind of not saying things they shouldn't be saying. And then I asked him, so why didn't you check my manuscript then? You have no idea what I'm going to say. And say, well, that's actually Arthur Urbano's responsibility. But it may also be that since I'm representing the Jewish side tonight, maybe I have what we call in German Narrenfreiheit, that is the freedom to say whatever I want. And I'm going to make use of it. So without further ado, my topic tonight I called Christian-Jewish Dialogue and its Discontents, or Why Nothing is Simple When It Comes to Jewish-Catholic Relations. And I have just a few slides, just so that you can anticipate what's coming. And I have my watch here, and I'm trying to stick to 20 minutes. My first slide will stand there while I'm talking about the first kind of complication, which is the long history of Jewish-Christian relations. 3 subdivisions, the early days, the days since Emperor Constantine, and then the result of what some people have called the lachrymose history of the Jews. Then the next slide will be the second complication, the 20th century, the Church and the Third Reich, Vatican II, and the statement We Remember by John Paul II. And then I'll talk about some systematic complications, where we'll speak about the dissimilarity between the Church and the Jewish people, the difference in theological perspectives, and the asymmetry between the Church and the Jews. And finally, about anti-Semitism, I'll give you a definition. I will give you a definition of anti-Judaism, and finally speak about why Jews cannot this is a misspelling. It should be accept. Well, wait a minute. Cannot accept church teaching about the Jews. All right, let me go back to the beginning. Now I have to wait. Okay, I'll start over with the beginning. Here we go. My first slide. High tech, low tech, I don't know. There we go, from the beginning. All right, I'm going to my first complication. History. The history of Christian-Jewish relations is as old as Christianity. My first point, the early days. The early days saw the Christians engaged in a struggle for self-definition. The Christians had to figure out who they were. Were they a kind of Greek or Roman movement? Were they a kind of Jewish movement? Or were they none of the above? Something entirely new. Arthur Droge has a nice book that's called, or that speaks of neither Homer nor Moses. It's neither the Greek nor the Jewish tradition entirely, but somehow absorbs both of those and yet is something different. There were other contenders in the early days of the church who believed that what Jesus Christ represented was something entirely otherworldly, something that had to do with knowing the origin of the soul, and if you know that origin of the soul, you're redeemed, you're done. You don't need a church, you don't need the Old Testament, you don't need the Israelite history. In fact, you need no history at all. You only need to know the eternal origin of your soul, and you can immediately leave behind all the dark stuff and be redeemed. That's called gnosis, with a G. The Gnostic movement was the big competitor with the church. And against that movement, the church argued, no, you need scripture. You need the story of prophetic antecedents. You need to go back to how God's providence was manifest within this world of creation. And it's not just about the soul, it's also about the body. So the proto-Orthodox Church insisted on continuity with the history of the Israelites, with their prophets, with their patriarchs, with the prophetic tradition. There was also an issue with Roman society. Roman society was not very fond of innovation in the world of religion. They wanted things to be as they always were. So the Christians had to argue that, in fact, they were not an innovation. They were merely the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. They were, in fact, as ancient as Abraham. They were as ancient as Adam himself. They go back to the time of creation. So for that reason, too, they insisted on retaining the scriptures of the Israelites and seeing themselves merely as Israel in the true sense, not an innovation. But on the other hand, they didn't want to be confused with the Jews. When the early Christian community was forming, the Jews were engaged in a very tenuous relationship with the Roman authorities that exploded in two major rebellions that were violently crushed. The Christians at some point left Jerusalem and decided not to participate in this rebellion. They were not the only Jews who decided that rebellion was not for them. There were many Jewish aristocrats that decided that rebellion was not for them. Josephus Flavius, after participating in the rebellion, famously went over to the other side. Not that he really had a choice, but he made the best of it. In any case, to not be confused with the Jews, Christians who had so vigorously inscribed themselves into the Israelite scriptures and into those traditions had to argue that they were not just Jews. They were different from the Jews. Because what is the difference? Well, the Jews are those stubborn deniers of Christ who God punished with the destruction of their temple, whereas the Christians had taken on the status of the true elect. They were not just Jews. They were more than the Jews, more truly inscribed into those scriptures of the Jews that go back to Abraham and Adam. They were not compromised by the law of Moses that represented the spirit over the letter, that were redeemed by the pre-existent Logos incarnate, that was imprinted on Israel as its exemplar or typos that the Christians eventually fulfilled in a kind of Platonizing hierarchy of archetype and ectype. Again, the temple destruction was the exhibit A. It proved the Jews rejected and the Christians right. Now, this language that the early Christians developed was a language of polemics. It was embedded in the writings we now have as the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the letters, in the fathers of the church. It's the language of a persecuted, sometimes resentful and much embattled minority association within the Roman and Greco-Roman world, competing with other Jewish movements at a time when Romans and Jews did not get along very well. So, let's move to number 2 here, since Constantine. What happened when Christianity became a state-supported religion? At the time when Constantine turned to the God of the Christians as the God in whose name he fought his wars for the sake of unification of the Roman Empire, Christians numbered only about 10% of the Roman Empire. So he didn't do it for the sake of the numbers. The Christians were still a small, recently highly persecuted minority. And yet he chose and selected Christianity as, or the Christian God as the God in whose name he fought to unite the empire under the motto of one God, one emperor, one empire. What happened to that language that the Christians brought into the situation? That language that had been shaped in times of persecution, resentment, struggles for self-definition. It became the language of triumph. The Jews became a kind of exemplar of what happens to people who reject the gospel. As the church triumphed over the synagogue, it became manifest what that meant for the Jews in form of words, in form of sermons, in forms of discriminating laws, in terms of images that became ingrained in the Christian imagination. There are wonderful medieval depictions of the 2 women facing one another in Strasbourg and other churches. Ecclesia, the triumphant woman, and the synagogue with the broken staff. What this meant was that the church, with the power empowered by the state, by the Roman state, began to map a spiritual claim of supersession onto the social and political reality of Jews within the Roman Empire and across the Roman Empire. That manifested, for example, in legal discrimination against Jews rebuilding synagogues that were just crumbling, or building houses of worship that were higher than the church. Laws of discrimination, and there were all kinds of variants on this, that were also eventually adopted by the Muslims, who, of course, took over Syria and Palestine, that had been the heartland of Christendom, and used the same types of laws in order to place the Jews within their society. So they didn't invent those laws, the Christians did. What ensued was a long history of the spread of a kind of state-sponsored Christianity that used the Jews as it needed and assigned a certain place for them within society. In Jewish memory, what stands out are the moments of particular suffering that may not be representative, that may not actually explain why Jews tended to thrive in many places for many centuries, and why at some points Christians and Jews got along just as well as they seem to be getting along right here and right now. So this may not be as untypical and unprecedented as it may seem if we only look at the lachrymose history of the Jews, but that's the one that we remember. What we remember are moments such as the Crusades, when Jews were massacred along the Rhine, before those knights and other people who were sent by that divine mission to liberate the holy places from the infidel Turks ever reached the Danube and made it onto the area of the Ottoman Empire, and ever made it to places like Edessa or Antioch or Jerusalem herself. There were Jews along the Rhine. There were infidels to kill right then and there. The bishops of Mainz, Worms and Speyer, towns in whose shadow I grew up, resisted it. They warned against it. They didn't like this idea. They tried to protect their Jews, but to no avail. And the massacres of those days were inscribed in Jewish memory as moments of martyrdom, where, like Abraham, who offered his son Isaac as a sacrifice, Jewish fathers, instead of allowing their children to be converted, rather killed their children and then they killed themselves. When Christians were frustrated over the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, when Jerusalem was taken back by the Kurdish Sultan Saladin and brought to an end the near century of Christian rule of Jerusalem, almost immediately afterwards the Jews were expelled from Kent in England, and there was the beginning of a wave of Jewish expulsions from Western Europe. When in the 13th century the church decided on the doctrine of transubstantiation, that is the notion that the host does not just represent the body of Christ, but is the body of Christ, subsequently Jews were accused of all kinds of nefarious doings and manipulations of the host desecration that paralleled and reenacted the supposed Jewish killing of Christ himself. Host desecration, blood libel, well poisoning, and other things where the Jews were accused of. Of course, those were not very sophisticated times, you have to understand. People were not generally educated. They did not generally go to college. They generally couldn't read, but they could see. They could see those images. They could hear those sermons, and they understood the Jews were the nefarious, demonic people. And on certain occasions, they could be accused of all kinds of ills, and they were treated accordingly. Their holy books were banished and burned, and they were pressed into leaving Western Europe and eventually settled in Eastern Europe and became an Eastern European people, predominantly, at least the folks that had been expelled from France and Germany. In the early modern period, in the Renaissance and Reformation, when everything looked brighter, and ancient forms of education became available in Europe and beautiful art was produced. At the same time, the Jews were ghettoized. They were put into special places of habitation, if they found themselves at all, in Western European cities. Those ghettos were established in Venice and in Rome for the first time. It was the time of the Counter-Reformation, when the Church was beginning to feel the threat to the unity of the Latin realm and was fighting a war for its own survival. The Jews, once again, gave an opportunity to assert power at the very time when the power of the Church began to wane. Modernity. Modernity is a time when people in Europe, after about a century of religious warfare between Protestants and Catholics in the 17th century, decided it was time to put society on a new foundation. Foundation of a republic, of a foundation of rights, a foundation of non-sectarianism. Eventually, this leads to a vigorous literature and promotion of enlightenment rationalism, and at the same time also to political movement that some of them explode in revolution. Modern society was built on assumptions of equality, of non-discrimination, and therefore also raised the possibility of integrating the Jews as citizens into modern states, the age of emancipation. From the perspective of many in the Catholic hierarchy and many Catholic Christians, that was not necessarily so well received, because it meant an end to the privilege of the Church over the political sphere. It led to secularization. That means literally a loss of property of the Church. And it led to a change that the Church did not easily absorb. Now, when you look at history from a very broad perspective, we may actually be able to say that the fact that it only took about 150 years for the church to make its peace with modern politics and the modern society is actually not so bad, given that it is a 2,000-year-old institution. So we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And historians can look at it at a very broad and long perspective. But it was not an easy process. Anti-modernism, anti-enlightenment, anti-secularization, anti-liberalism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Judaism, or rather anti-Semitism, became part and parcel of Catholic rhetoric as the power of the Catholic Church over society was shrinking and was threatened, and the Jews were perceived as the beneficiaries, as the winners in this process of modernization. They were perceived. They may not have been winners in every respect, in every place, but they were easily targeted because of that long-standing tradition of enmity and discrimination. So, if that's what Jewish history looks like to Jews, it is a lachrymose history. It's full of tears, it's full of suffering. And it is not surprising that the Jews did not convert in masses, that they did not respond favorably to being preached at or being displayed in passion plays or in sculptures and other ways, or ghettoized, but rather stubbornly clung to their own tradition. The conversion of the Jews did not happen. It is also not surprising that the Jews felt drawn to the ideal of the natural rights of all men and embraced emancipation and, in many cases, assimilation, though not everywhere. There was also anti-modernism among the Jews. Because many Jews also had adopted ways of thinking about the Jews and the Jewish people as a kind of mystical body that represented divine election, that embodied a kind of chosen people that was tied to both living by divine law and by imbuing that life according to divine law with mystical meanings that is actually very similar and can be very much compared to the way in which the Catholic Church sees itself as a mystical body of Christ. So both of these trends, modernization among the Jews, assimilation among the Jews, the development of modern assumptions about what it means to be a Jew, and very traditional anti-modernist Judaism, both vitiated against any kind of thought that the Jews might be on the verge of conversion. Although in the early 19th century you have actually lots of conversions because of the kind of ever retreating options of integration into Christian society. So far the first complication. Second complication, the 20th century. The Church and the Third Reich, and we will hear more about this from John Conley, who knows infinitely more about this than I do. Whatever we can say about the courage of individuals, and there were some courageous individuals, and to have courage to resist Hitler and to resist pressures and to resist the fear of death, and to stand up for another people or just for one person and to do something for that one person and to help another person, to hide them, to give them food, to treat them with dignity. According to my father-in-law, who was there, who experienced things, he came from Poland, he was in concentration camps, he was in one of the infamous death marches to Bergen-Belsen. To him, it took infinite courage to resist Hitler in any form or fashion. So let's not rush to judgment and assume that people now would be so much more courageous, and if Hitler came along today we would all act differently, because it's not that simple. So let's just admit for a moment that without exculpating anyone, we have to understand that resistance was exceptional. And yet, we have to say that on some level, in hindsight, we are disappointed. And we are compelled to say that whatever the Church did in those years on behalf of the Jews was inadequate. It was inadequate. It did not really help as the church, as we see it now, should have helped. Again, I wasn't there at the time. I was not in a situation of responsibility. But given the size of the atrocities, given the fact that the church was even convinced, by and large, that anti-Semitism was sinful, even then, that racism was openly condemned, it was still inadequate to the size of the atrocities. And we have to admit that. Individuals were courageous, but the church as a whole failed. And it failed in part because of its deep-seated anti-Judaism, its modern prejudice against the Jews as a group allied with Bolshevism and socialism, and its tacit sympathy or open sympathy with the part of Nazism that was very much in line with the interest of the church, which was its anti-liberalism and its anti-Bolshevism. As John Connolly said very clearly in his book and said this morning, Vatican II opened a new chapter by deploring anti-Semitism and tacitly dropping the liturgical condemnation of the Jews as deicides. The Jews are no longer liturgically accused of having killed God. Thank goodness. We are no longer deicides. That's a big thing. It lifts a huge cloud from the relations between Jews and Catholics. And instead of conversion, the express aim of the Fathers of the Council of Vatican II and hence of the Church is to foster mutual understanding. And that's why we're here. Now there are more recent statements, especially the first official church statement on the Shoah, we remember, but it fell short of Jewish expectations, in that these statements, especially we remember, that was issued under the authority of John Paul II. It fell short of Jewish expectations in that it mixed the historical and the theological in ways that sounded weak to Jewish ears. It was an insufficient acceptance of blame for what the Jews perceived as the complicity and sustained failure of the church as such, not just as the failure of certain Christians. And we can discuss this further later on. Let me finally come to the systematic complications. There is a dissimilarity between the church and the Jewish people. The church is a centralized, theological, political body. It's a hierarchy. It's an institution, globally disseminated, but it is a centralized, theological, political body. The Jewish people, on the other hand, is an ethnic religious network of communities with no central theological or political authority. While the Vatican can speak for the church, no one can speak for the Jews. Not even the Prime Minister of Israel or the President of the State of Israel. Even if they may try. Not unlike the Christian movement, the Jewish community is divided along ethnic and religious lines. Who of them speaks for the Jews? I certainly don't. There's also a difference in theological perspective on the Jews. The Jews, whatever that means, can never be to themselves what they are to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church can never be to the Jews what the Jews are to the Catholic Church. Vatican II recognizes Abraham's stock, we heard about this morning, the people of Israel, or the Jews, as spiritually linked to the Church and its mystery by virtue of the fact that, quote, the beginnings of her faith and her election are found already among the patriarchs, Moses and the prophets, end quote. But it is not part of the self-understanding of the Jews that the Church's mystery is, quote, found already among the patriarchs, Moses and the prophets. Jews don't find that mystery there. That's the Church's teaching, not something Jews can find there. Also, according to Vatican II, the, quote, spiritual patrimony, apologize, common to Christians and Jews is so great that the Sacred Synod wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect which is the fruit, above all, of biblical and theological studies, as well as of fraternal dialogues. In other words, since we have so much of the same sacred scriptures in common, we should study these scriptures in the expectation that the spiritual patrimony will become evident in mutual understanding and respect. The guiding assumption behind this kind of dialogue over scripture is not that Christians ought to understand how much they owe to the Hebrew Bible and thus share with the Jews, but that Jews should also understand something about what they have in common with the Catholic Church. This is, in essence, a recipe not for dialogue, but for persuasion. The relationship between the Church and the Jews is and remains asymmetrical, because the Jews are part of Christian doctrine, but the Christians are not part of Jewish doctrine. Oops. There's my last slide. Implicit and explicit anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Anti-Semitism, here's the definition, is a political ideology, sometimes enriched with pseudo-scientific racism that blames the Jews for the ills of modernity, including the undermining of the pre-modern order that was based on heredity and clerical privilege, which hurt the aristocracy and the church. The establishment of liberal regimes and the promotion of social mobility, equality, and equal opportunity for everyone without regard to creed, nationality, gender, etc., which vitiates against romantic nationalism. And we can, in our discussion, I want to come back to that idea of romantic nationalism. The freedom of thought and expression, which insults value conservatives. So these are the things that anti-Semitism focuses on. The undermining of the pre-modern order that is considered a natural order or a revealed order. The establishment of liberal regimes, the freedom of thought and expression. Anti-Semitism likes none of these. And they single out the Jews not just as beneficiaries, but the secret masterminds that sought the erosion of traditional privilege, national cohesion, church privilege, and social mores. And that was used to accuse the Jews of all of those things, of masterminding all of these things, was used as fuel in mass politics, mass agitation, propaganda, to rile up the masses against the Jews who were already predisposed not to like them. Modern anti-Semitism not only blamed the Jewish influence on society for all its ills, but claimed that no manner of change could erase Jewish traits. That's very important. That were instead inherent in Jewish blood. The only way to relieve society from the Jewish threat was to eliminate the Jews from society. Anti-Semitism is inherently aiming at the elimination of the Jews. Thankfully, consistent with its mandate to seek the persuasion and pray for the eventual conversion of the Jews, the Church unambiguously rejected this type of explicit anti-Semitism as unchristian and sinful. That's also very important. What the Church did not openly or tacitly reject back in the 30s was the need for the Jews to be put in their place. A point that was made explicit in the so-called hidden encyclical of 1938 that was never signed, and thank goodness for that. Pius XII was susceptible to giving Hitler more leeway than he should have, because, like others, he saw in the Nazis a natural ally against Bolshevism. One must recall that anti-Semites, even those explicitly opposed to racial anti-Semitism, and there were those too, were nevertheless convinced that the Jews were among the leaders and beneficiaries of the Bolshevik Revolution. The lack of resistance to Hitler points to what I call the implicit anti-Semitism of religious and national anti-modernism, a kind of anti-Jewish conservatism that weakened the Catholic as well as the Protestant resistance to Hitler. Explicit anti-Judaism is also very clear. It is the position that the Jews as a whole are responsible for the death of Christ, a position that Vatican II was the first official statement of the Church to disown. And we should be glad of that. No longer are we collectively and forever accused of having to bear the guilt of having killed God and hence deserve to suffer. But the leaders of the Jews and some of their contemporaries are still held responsible for having killed Christ. And even though the Jews should not be referred to as repudiated or cursed, they are still displaced by the Church as the people of God. What I see as the implied anti-Judaism of this kind of statement is simply the fact that Christians believe they have the right to derive from Scripture a doctrine about the status of the Jews as God sees them, whether or not this status is that of an accursed people or even as a blessed people. I don't like philo-Semitism any more than I like anti-Semitism. Philo-Semitism is also very dangerous. Jews cannot accept, sorry, there it is, there's that thing where I have to strike it out again. The Jews cannot accept the church's doctrine about the Jewish people as true. This is not to say that Jewish tradition and liturgy does not contain equally problematic statements about others, though perhaps not explicitly about the Christians. Maybe that's the insult. If it only contains something that's explicitly anti-Christian, then at least we would be equal. But we're not. There may well be a tradition of anti-Christian sentiments embedded in Jewish thought that would need to be looked at carefully in any genuine dialogue. Perhaps the Jewish-Christian dialogue today, after Vatican II and after John Paul II's insistence on remembrance of the Shoah, must indeed begin by considering not just the presumed common patrimony, but our differences. Thank you very much.
So I first want to also thank Arthur and Providence College for the invitation to speak here. It's a pleasure and a privilege, and also wonderful to meet new friends, as Michael said. Can you all hear me? Okay. So this year, 2015, is the 50th anniversary of the Vatican II Declaration Nostra Aetate. Vatican II was a council of the Catholic Church that took place in Rome for 3 years, 1962 to 1965, and is considered to have revolutionized the Church in certain substantial ways. And one of the most important statements was indeed this declaration passed in October of 1965, overwhelmingly by the bishops present. I think it was something like 1,900 against 190, something like that. And indeed, the council itself featured as voting members bishops. It was a council of the bishops. But as I said this morning, the bishops didn't write the declarations. They didn't write the statements of Vatican II. It was theologians who did that. Thinkers, intellectuals, Catholic theologians who were called upon by the bishops to advise them. So it's a little bit like the situation in Congress in a way, in which the Congress men and women raise their hands and vote on bills, but they're actually advised by experts. So what I do in my book is my book that appeared, I think 3 years ago, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, is I study these experts. I study the people who stood behind the new teaching at Vatican II, the teaching in Nostra Aetate. The odd and interesting thing about these intellectuals, these advisors to the bishops, is that they themselves were very deeply implicated in the kinds of things that Michael has just been telling you about, certainly anti-Judaism, and maybe even to some senses anti-Semitism, because the two are related. It's difficult to say exactly how, and maybe we can talk a bit about this. But there is a relation between the two. The irony is that the leading figures that actually found the formulations that made it possible for the church to move beyond anti-Judaism themselves were dedicated to a prime act that is now considered anti-Judaic, and that is mission to the Jews. So the two figures that I find most important, and there are just a couple dozen actually, and it's an intellectual trajectory that goes back to the 1930s. That is, the people I study, they were called upon by the bishops in 1962 to advise the council, but their work on Christian-Jewish relations went back to the 1920s and 30s. I don't have pictures. They're regular-looking people. I don't know if I really need to have pictures of these guys. Two people I'll just point out. There are a number. John Österreicher means Austrian in German. John Maria Österreicher, or Johannes Maria Österreicher, he was born in 1904 to Jewish parents in Moravia, present-day Czech Republic, near the city of Olomouc. For complicated reasons, as a medical student in Vienna in the early 1920s, he converted to Christianity, became a Catholic. He struggled, actually. He wasn't sure whether Catholicism or Protestantism. He read Kierkegaard. It was very important for him in becoming Catholic. He became a priest in the late 1920s of the Diocese of Vienna. And then in the 1930s, he did two things. He ran the Mission to the Jews of the Diocese of Vienna, and he fought against Nazi racism in the Diocese of Vienna. At this time, Austria was not part of Germany. That changed in 1938. And then John Österreicher fled Austria, went to the US. All of my characters are originally from Europe, but many of them wound up around New York City after fleeing the Nazis. And he became the leading expert in American Catholicism on the Jews. And in 1961, he was taken on to the Vatican as an advisor. The other person is Karl Thieme, Thieme. He was also a convert. He was originally born a Protestant in Germany. He was a German theologian, also a socialist, which I find interesting. He's the most important theological figure in Nostra Aetate, virtually unknown, and interestingly, a man of the left, which was at the time quite unusual because it was thought that Catholicism and socialism were completely incompatible. In the 1930s, he escaped Germany. He was actually involved in anti-Nazi resistance. He left in 1935. He settled in Switzerland, became friends with John Österreicher in Austria, and the two of them worked out formulas that are found in Nostra Aetate in the subsequent decades, 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But the point of my book, the reason for writing, is to show that these formulas did not come easily. They were the result of struggle. And the great irony of the book is that they were adopted by people who were dedicated to mission to the Jews, which is precisely what Nostra Aetate undid, a tradition that taught that Jews had to become Christian in order to be saved. So what exactly did Nostra Aetate say? Michael's given you some of the basic points. I'll just review them. First, that Christ and Christianity are from Judaism, that Christ not only was Jewish, but Christ is Jewish. Right? Because according to Catholic teaching, Christ is alive. If Christ is alive, Christ is Jewish. The same for his mother, and the same is true of his disciples. He emerged from a Jewish environment. Second, Jews are not guilty for the death of Christ. This is this idea that goes all the way back to the early days of the church. They were neither guilty at the time, nor are they guilty presently. The third thing, that Jews are most dear to God. That comes directly from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And the fourth thing, that is maybe the most important, and it's also quite strange, and I'll have to ask for your indulgence in talking a bit about this, has to do, on the one hand, with this question of mission to the Jews, this insistence upon making Jews Christian, but it also has to do with something that is known in theology as eschatology. Eschatology is not something that many of us think of on an everyday basis. It means the end of the world, the end of time, right? What happens at the end of time? Well, this was on the minds of these theologians constantly, especially in the 1930s, and I'll talk a bit more about this. But the point of Nostra Aetate is that it undid the idea that Jews have to convert to Christianity at the end of time. Instead, Nostra Aetate says that the church looks forward to the day, known to God alone, on which all peoples will address the Lord in a single voice and serve him shoulder to shoulder. That is the statement that was worked out at Vatican II. Now, none of this, from today's perspective, sounds very interesting or surprising or revolutionary. A lot of it seems commonsensical. How could one hold an entire people for all time guilty for the acts of perhaps a few many centuries ago? This is the so-called crime of deicide. It seems absurd from our current perspective. And it seemed absurd, really, even at the time of the Council and earlier. Nevertheless, it was held by a lot of Christians. Or the idea that Jews are loved by God. Why is it necessary to say that? Aren't all people loved by God? Why go out of the way to say that Jews are loved by God? And the fact that these statements seem so commonsensical makes it actually very difficult to talk about Nostra Aetate's history. But as a historian, I'm here to tell you that it was a revolution, because before Vatican II, before the Council, before the 1960s, Christian thought was precisely the opposite. And the opposite tradition, again, it's been outlined for you by Michael. It's called anti-Judaism. It's essentially the reverse of Nostra Aetate, including the idea that Jews killed God, therefore they lived under a curse, they were destined to wander about the earth. that Jews may have been a people, but they were not a religion, because Jewish ritual was thought to be dead and meaningless and lifeless. Oesterreicher himself wrote this in something we read this morning. Because of this curse, the Jews were to endure suffering till the end of time, and at the end of time, they were supposed to become Christians. So the end of time was not a time when all humans would address God in one voice, shoulder to shoulder, but a time when Jews would become Christians. In the meantime, Christians needed to be protected from Jews because they supposedly exuded a kind of spiritual danger. Now, note the central thing about anti-Judaism, this is maybe one of the most important things I'll say, the core element of anti-Judaism is not stereotypes about the Jews, right? That's how we usually think of anti-Jewish ideas these days, or ideas about the Jews that are incorrect. Anti-Judaism was not about saying that the Jews are overrepresented in certain professions. It was not at its core about saying that the Jews had certain characteristics, that they were liberal or modern or communist or supported Freemasonry. All of these ideas we have about Jews, that are current in people in the sort of anti-Semitic imaginary about Jews. This is not what anti-Judaism was about. Nostra Aetate, therefore, was not at its core about overturning those ideas. Nostra Aetate does denounce racism. It denounces anti-Semitism and all kinds of hatred against any group. But Nostra Aetate went beyond simply saying that Christians should love Jews. Crucially, what Nostra Aetate said is that God loves Jews. The deeper essence of anti-Judaism was about a vision of the Jews in history. It was precisely about the relation between God and the Jews. It was about God's plan for the Jews and for humanity, and the belief that the two were inseparable. As I've mentioned, anti-Judaism implied that until Jews became Christian, they were separated. They were somehow cut off from God's love. They were permitted to live, but only as an example of what happened to people who were divorced from the gospel. So here is where, in my view, Nostra Aetate made its revolutionary contribution. It stood the old idea on its head. Rather than Jews of all peoples on the earth being specially cursed, Nostra Aetate says that Jews live in a continuing relationship, a continuing covenant with God, that they are loved by God. The fact that Nostra Aetate spoke in this way was not due to the charity or generosity or philo-Semitism, by the way, of the church, but to the fact that Jews had been made for centuries part of a Christian narrative in a way that no other people was. In a sense, what Christians did is they usurped, for their own purposes, the story of the Jews. They claimed to know with certainty what the future held for the Jews. And Jews, as human beings, had no role in their own history, in this view. In the shadow of the Holocaust, this is after the war, so 1950s, 1960s, during the Council, this usurpation, this forced inclusion of Jews in a Christian narrative came to seem as something that had historically caused great harm. Because, after all, the Nazis, as well as Christian doctrine, expected that Jews would suffer and Jews would disappear. The bishops at Vatican II, and I've read their discussions, they felt in a very indistinct way that somehow this tradition had a relation to the Nazis' final solution. So that's, I think, a key component of Nostra Aetate. Another way of looking at what anti-Judaism was in terms of God's plan for humanity. And I'll talk a bit about that. The issue was not only that God punished Jews, according to these old ideas, but also that the Jews themselves were punishing humanity. Before Vatican II, Christians believed not only that the failure to accept Christ as Messiah had caused Jews to be cursed, but much more importantly, for Christian theology, by this act the Jews had put off salvation for all humanity. John Oesterreicher in the 1930s was deeply disturbed and frustrated by the victories of Nazism. It seemed to him that Hitler was rolling over Europe and nobody was opposing him. And it seemed to him that this could mean only one thing, that the final days were approaching. And at that point he reflected that if only the Jews had said yes to the Messiah 2,000 years previously, then all of this could have been avoided. That even then, already then, God's mercy would have streamed upon and redeemed the world. Therefore, at that point in the 1930s, Oesterreicher expressed with much chagrin that a world that was more troubled than ever before, facing unimaginable evils of racism, that the Jews, by not becoming Christian, were somehow holding back God's hand from resolving this problem. It was as if Jews, by refusing to accept Christ as Messiah, were holding back God's hand. They were in some odd way even more powerful than God, frustrating God's desire to redeem humanity. The tragic face of this view during the Holocaust was, of course, that if Jews were living under a curse, cut off from God's love until they became Christian, then all the bad things that happened to them in history seemed to be fulfillment of this curse, the acting out of God's will. And therefore, during the Holocaust, some Christians who were deeply believing Christians and accepted these views, who helped Jews against Nazism, actually came to feel a kind of schizophrenia, that they could only understand the suffering that Jews were undergoing in terms of this anti-Judaism, and therefore to defy Hitler seemed to be in an odd way to defy God's will. So, how did this all change? If these views were so deeply rooted from tradition, and there was no other source in tradition for Christians to rely upon to understand Judaism in history, how did it change? The one positive thing about this tradition is that it was never proclaimed dogmatic. It was never proclaimed magisterial teaching. It was never pronounced by a pope. It was never made part of the teaching of a church council. And therefore, in an odd way, it was susceptible to being changed. But how did it change? How do great course changes happen in general in institutions that need change? Does it happen that people who have enlightenment simply emerge upon the scene and impose their ideas upon those institutions? People perhaps imbued with higher wisdom? What happens in our own country, for example, when we're in deep trouble politically? Does a new administration suddenly come with people with bright ideas who change things? Is that how change takes place politically? Well, in this case, it wasn't the case that suddenly theologians who never took part in erroneous or teaching that was lacking suddenly emerged upon the scene. Right up until the council, John Österreicher believed in mission to the Jews, yet he was the person at the council who wrote the new teaching. The context of the post-war years was in general very difficult for Jewish-Christian relations because the church, after 1945, actually felt with some justification that it too had been persecuted by the Nazi regime. The church thought of itself as also having been a victim of Nazism. There were many priests, for example, in Dachau. Until his death in 1958, Pius XII was thought of as having been an opponent of Nazism if he was credited for having rescued Jews. The church, with some justification, was credited with having been the odd institution, maybe the one institution on earth that really came out against racism pretty consistently during the interwar years, in contrast to virtually all in the other institutions. And furthermore, and maybe most importantly, if this old anti-Judaism was established in the tradition of the church, going back to the early church fathers, if it was theologically unquestioned, how could any event in history change it, right? If a priest were to say in 1935, according to Matthew, we must baptize all nations, how could a priest in 1955 suddenly say that we don't have to baptize Jews? And furthermore, why was mission a problem? Mission, after all, didn't kill people, right? Mission to the Jews. Why was this an issue? To sum up, it wasn't clear after the war that any event in history, even the Holocaust, could change theology. So in the book, I show how these thinkers struggled, and they did struggle for insight for 3 decades, beginning in the 1930s, in their anti-Nazi polemics, all the way to the council, when John Österreicher became an advisor at the council. This is a path with many strange twists, things I didn't expect before writing the book. For example, it isn't actually true that the church was unambiguously opposed to racism. I said it opposed racism more than any other institution you can think of in the 1930s. But there were some very influential Catholic theologians who actually espoused racism in Germany in the 1930s. Those are precisely the people that Österreicher and his friends opposed in Germany. But this was also a time when people didn't quite know what race was. It was the war itself that brought clarity on that point. Another thing I discovered that was a great surprise is that virtually everybody in the Catholic Church who cared about this issue between the 1930s and all the way to the council were themselves converts to Catholicism. They were mostly converts from Judaism. There's a certain logic to that because as converts from Judaism, they were the people who were on the receiving end of racial anti-Semitism, even from some Catholics. The irony in retrospect is that when these theologians thought they were dealing with and had done with racism, what they did in fact was reveal the church's own anti-Judaism, at first to Jews and then to themselves. Why? Because when these theologians looked at the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, they were convinced that God was giving the Jews a sign that they must repent and convert. And the more intense the suffering, the closer it seemed to these theologians was the resolution of this supposed problem. Which brings me to the third thing that shocked me in this study, which is that, in fact, these people believed, all of them, they believed they were living at the end of time in the 1930s. The major thing that they did to try to get the Vatican to act in these years was to try to have the Pope issue a statement in 1938 and 39 in favor of the Jews. And the reason they did this is because they thought if the Pope issued a statement in favor of the Jews at this time, it would seem so selfless that it would seem to Jews as a miracle, and that would cause them en masse to enter the church. That is why they did it. Not to say they wouldn't have liked it to happen for the virtue of the issue itself. Another thing that surprised me is how few people were interested in this subject before Vatican II. In the 1950s, if you look in the pages of Catholic newspapers and journals, everywhere really, there's virtually no consideration of what the war meant or the Holocaust meant. The word didn't even exist at that time for Christian-Jewish relations. And finally, what was kind of surprising is that virtually everybody who worked on this subject, including the Cardinal at Vatican II, were of German background. The problematic theology came from Germany, and the resolutions came from Germany. That's what I say in the book. Let me just now gradually approach a conclusion and return to this tricky matter of eschatology, the eschatological issue, relating to the issue of what I call vision. Vision about, Nostra Aetate was about the vision of the Jews, the general understanding of the Jews. And what you find over the decades is that the people that I study confronted the eschatological challenge again and again. In the 1930s, for example, John Österreicher, he was the head of the mission to the Jews in Vienna. He crossed swords with the head rabbi of Vienna, David Feuchtwank. And Feuchtwank said that although Österreicher was an opponent of anti-Semitism, he was actually a false friend to the Jews because of his mission to the Jews. And Feuchtwank said that these false friends want to destroy us because we are a living admonition to the conscience of the nations. To which Österreicher replied, "One must be deaf to the voice of God if one does not understand with all the suffering that Jews are undergoing, that God has let come over Israel, He wants to pull Israel toward him." In other words, Feuchtwank was saying, mission to the Jews is destruction. Österreicher's answer was, until you convert, you will continue to suffer. That is the thinking of the major drafter of Nostra Aetate 25 years later in the late 1930s. A real turning point was arrived in, this is a second incident that I'll mention. After the war, Karl Thieme, the theologian who worked with Österreicher, was living in Germany. He was living as a professor in Mainz, and he was installed by the American occupation authorities in West Germany as the head of something that they imported to Germany called the Societies for Christian-Jewish Understanding. And as a result of that, he had a lot of meetings with rabbis and Jewish thinkers, something that was unthinkable before the war. I think in some ways the most important thing that happened after the war for Christian-Jewish understanding is that Christians began listening to Jews and they began understanding what it sounded like when they uttered their anti-Judaism to Jews and then had Jews tell them what it sounded like. That was a shocking experience, and it was something that they hadn't learned before the war. So in 1948, Karl Thieme wrote what he thought was a refutation of anti-Semitism in a journal that he edited in Germany. So he wrote the following: that Christians must not think of Jews as being forever abandoned by God. To make the point, he took a story from Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, in which Christ treats a dead girl as if she were sleeping and tells her to get up. In similar terms, Thieme reasoned that Jews were not spiritually dead, they were only sleeping. They would awaken when Christ finally came and commanded them to arise. So this journal made its way to Israel, where his new friend Martin Buber was living, and Buber read these lines and was shocked, actually was outraged. So he wrote the following letter to Karl Thieme, I had been persuaded up to now that you were interested in real understanding with those religious Jews who have understanding for people acting as faithful Christians. But how should such understanding be possible if you identify spiritual life for the Jews with their readiness to be converted? I have my spiritual life in direct contact to God and myself, and in addition, I have my bodily life. I cannot believe that God would allow a Christian to question this fact, and equally, I cannot believe that God would allow me to act this way toward a Christian. Judaism and Christianity stand united in the mystery of our Father and Judge. Therefore, the Jew can speak of the Christian, and the Christian of the Jew, only in fear and trembling before the mystery of God. On this basis alone can there be genuine understanding between Jew and Christian. It's interesting here that we hear echoes of Kierkegaard in the writings of Buber. The final incident that I'll mention took place during the council. This is a question that came up this morning. What was the role of Jews talking to Christians and helping to create the new teaching of the Catholic Church? One important figure was the American Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who met Cardinal Bea, important figure at the council in the early 1960s, and is said to have told him that Jews wanted to be known and understood and respected as Jews. So Heschel was somebody that the cardinal and the bishops were listening to. In 1964, a crisis emerged at the council. So the document was passed in 1965. This is about a year earlier when it was in draft form. Conservative advisors to Paul VI doctored a draft version of the document and included the following text in a new draft with the following words: "It is also worth remembering that the union of the Jewish people with the church is part of the Christian hope. Therefore, following the teaching of the apostle, the church," meaning St. Paul, "the church waits with unshaken faith and deep longing for the entry of that people into fullness of the people of God established by Christ." Now note here that there's no mention of mission, there's no mention of forced conversion. However, Rabbi Heschel made the following declaration after this text was leaked to him and to the world press, that he was ready to go to Auschwitz at any time if faced with the alternative of conversion or death. That caused the bishops then to go back to the drawing board and rework this draft. So Heschel's words are memorable. They seem in retrospect perhaps a bit extreme because, as I mentioned, there's no word of mission or forced conversion in that text. But the text note did not talk about the union of all humans at the end of time. It talked again, this is the eschatological vision, of the union of the Jews with the church at the end of time. So again, the Jews are expected to follow a Christian script as quasi-automatons. In other words, it's a dehumanizing vision of the Jews. So Österreicher then supplied a new text which went into the final statement, which I read for you at the beginning. The church awaits the day known to God alone when all peoples will address the Lord in a single voice and serve him shoulder to shoulder. So it would seem this is the end of the eschatological vision problem. Was it? As you may know, in 2008, I'll just say a brief word about the current situation. There was an amendment to the Good Friday prayer by Pope Benedict XVI that was 16th. That was supposed to be read in the Latin version of the Good Friday prayer. It contained, I'm not going to try to read the Latin for you, which I couldn't do, contained the following words: "Let us also pray for the Jews that God our Lord should illuminate their hearts so that they will recognize Jesus Christ, the Savior of men." This was out of touch with the 1970 version of the Roman Missal for the vernacular use, which said the following: "Let us pray for the Jewish people, the first to hear the word of God, that they may continue to grow in the love of his name and faithfulness to his covenant. Almighty and eternal God, long ago you gave your promise to Abraham and his posterity. Listen to your church as we pray that the people you first made your own may arrive at the fullness of redemption." That is thought to be a reasonable statement. So this is what's interesting about the statement of Benedict, which was made without consulting anybody who knows about the issue, that Walter Kaspar, who is, by the way, one of Francis's favorite figures these days as a theologian, who was the head of the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with Jews, immediately began damage control. And he corrected, or I should say he reinterpreted the Pope's new prayer. He said the following: "The text is a prayer inspired by St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 11, which is the very text that speaks also of the unbroken covenant, is also the source of Nostra Aetate. It takes up Paul's eschatological hope that in the end of time all Israel will be saved. As a prayer, the text lays all in the hands of God and not in ours. It says nothing about the how and when. Therefore, there is nothing about missionary activities by which we take Israel's salvation in our hands. Let me make three quick points before I conclude. First point, before Vatican II, not only was there a so-called Jewish problem in the eyes of Catholics, Jews themselves were considered to be a problem. And therefore, this was a problem needing solution. The solution to this supposed problem was conversion. Second point, it was this dehumanizing vision of the Jews that made all forms of mission, including this eschatological idea that Jews would become Christians at the end of time, that they were slated to file sort of en masse into the Christian church, unacceptable in the age of dialogue. That is, in an age when Jews and Christians speak with each other, something that did not happen for many, many centuries. The third thing, if you look at the footnotes of Nostra Aetate, if you actually go to the Vatican website, all of these declarations are included with footnotes. You'll find that almost all of the footnotes come from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Just as Cardinal Caspar noted in his statement correcting Benedict. You note that the Church's solution to the traditional teaching of anti-Judaism, right, that went back all the way to the early Church, was to bypass all of tradition, including Church Fathers, Aquinas, and go back right to the earliest Scripture, to Paul's final letter, his letter sometimes called his Testament, letter to the Romans, chapters 9 to 11, where you get the major components of Nostra Aetate, that God loves the Jews, that the Jews are not rejected, that the covenant of God with the Jews will last till the end of time. Why does the Church focus on this one letter to the exclusion of so much else? Karl Thiemer would have said, and Cardinal Caspar didn't say this, that it's because this is the one place in the New Testament where the writer is actually addressing his audience about what the audience should think of the fact that, by and large, Jews did not recognize Christ as Messiah. But also, Nostra Aetate, I think, returns Christians, and this is, I think, the one point in the talk where I'm speaking actually as a Christian, as a lay Christian and a non-theologian. I think Nostra Aetate also returns us to a sense of mystery. Should human beings even be worried about things like eschatology? And with that, I'm going to conclude with an answer from Paul's letter to the Romans, which concludes his own agonized reflection on the failure of what he called his kinsmen, other Jews, to follow Christ. This is chapter 11 of the letter to the Romans. He concludes with the following lines. The depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has become his counselor? Who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. Thank you for your attention.
So now we'll have some time for our two speakers to maybe ask each other some questions and react to each other's talks, and then we'll have some time to open it up to the audience for questions.
Thank you, John, for this extraordinary, powerful introduction to the personages and the minds behind Nostra Aetate and their own paths from what is still a somewhat patronizing stance to one that came up with a language that was able to maintain church doctrine and at the same time open up a new chapter in Catholic Jewish relations in the way in which they, even in their own younger years, were not able to fully grasp. So it really shows the dramatic developments that led to this statement. I want to press you a little bit, or just ask you to speak a little bit more about the fact that many of these very complex individuals were converts. Some were converts from Judaism, like Österreicher, and some were converts from Protestantism, like Thieme, and you may also have mentioned Erik Peterson, who was one of the very strong figures in the 1930s, speaking against what he thought were the problems with monotheism as a political problem, and believed that that those in the Catholic Church in Germany who were somehow making common cause with the Nazis were really heretics. Many of these people started their lives somewhere else. They came from Protestant theology, they came from a Jewish experience. Why did they become so prominent in shaping Nostra Aetate, and what do you make of that?
Well, I think you can't ignore the fact that they themselves felt that they were coming under direct attack. So that was part of it, right? That the racism that they found in the church, there were people in the 1930s in the church who were preaching. For example, the most prominent preacher of the Diocese of Vienna, a Jesuit named Bichlemeyer, in the 1930s, taught that Jews had been born with certain genetic deficiencies that were passed on generation to generation, that derived from rejecting Christ, and that those deficiencies weren't done away with by baptism. So somebody like Österreicher, who had entered the church from a Jewish background, was of course outraged by this, and Bichlemeyer was a man he knew very well. So there's a way in which these people who had come from Judaism in particular were most sensitized to the problems of racism and of anti-Semitism. So that explains it in part. But it doesn't explain people like Thieme, right? And there I think I talk in my book about the phenomenon of border crossing. So these are people who had crossed from one world to another and were therefore in some ways more willing to take risks intellectually and imagine they could sort of understand the position of the other because they themselves were the other, they had been the other. There's a kind of a solidarity or a natural ability, willingness to enter another's position, in particular people who had been persecuted. I think that they were more able to think outside the box because they had moved, in Österreicher's case, for example, he had moved from Judaism to Christianity while believing all along that somehow he remained a Jew. So he had this odd kind of acrobatics of being a Jew and Christian at the same time. By the way, there's a French Cardinal Lustiger was very similar, and this is a man Österreicher greatly admired, also a convert. So there's a way in which the fact that these people had moved, sometimes they actually moved across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Dietrich von Hildebrandt, a philosopher who was also a convert and very important in the Vienna scene in the 1930s, he had grown up in both Germany and Italy. The most important figure in the French church in the 1930s, Father Charles, he had actually lived in German-speaking areas of France. So these are people who were comfortable in moving back and forth between worlds, and therefore they were mediators between them in a way. So that's their background. And the final thing I'll say is that they were, I hate to use this word, you used it earlier in a very different context, they were unbedingte. They were people who actually believed with passion because they were converts. So when Österreicher or Thieme became Catholics, like many converts, they knew why they had done it, and therefore they were going to hold the institution to its own truth with a kind of conviction that very few people held, or few people held, who had been born Catholic. So that would be a kind of a brief answer to that question.
So they were Catholics by choice, in other words, and
Yes.
that made a difference. They were not routine Catholics.
And they believed, I think they believed the church's teaching that all believers should be equal, right? And so that was the starting point for their outrage, I believe.
I have another question, if you have the patience.
Yeah, I do.
So you were saying that Jesus and Mary are Jewish. Did you notice that? I was really struck by that. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is something, I was telling you that I was in Poland last week giving a lecture in Sandomierz, which is a small Polish town that has an ancient cathedral that has a picture on the wall of a ritual murder. So it's a very troubling place for Polish Catholicism, and the Polish bishop there has people come and talk about Jewish-Christian relations on a regular basis. And in preparation, I was reading the most recent edition of a Polish Catholic journal called Znak from Krakow. It's published by a liberal Catholic group. It's been around for many decades, and it was actually in an interview in Znak that I came across this precise idea. It was, and that's where I get it from. But it's logical by Catholic thought. If Christ was assumed bodily into heaven, Christ exists as a human being. If Christ exists as a human being, Christ is Jewish. He remains Jewish. Christ is Jewish, and the same is true of Mary. Mary was assumed bodily into heaven, as you know, according to Catholic doctrine. Therefore, in other words, this is a correction that emerged, and sometimes when you get into these contexts where people are debating things very vigorously, they begin hearing what they're saying to each other. And I think that one Polish Catholic had said, Jesus was Jewish, and then the other Polish Catholic thought, well, hold on, if Jesus is still alive, then he is Jewish, right? So that's where that comes from.
All right, third question.
I'm not a theologian, by the way.
Third question. It's great. I love it. Let me play the devil's advocate on behalf of Benedict XVI. Probably not the devil's advocate, but exactly. So, if Nostra Aetate is a moment, or if Vatican II is the moment when the Church makes its peace with the modern world, in so many ways, and then the Church even gives up the desire for the conversion of the Jews. Isn't Benedict XVI right to remind the Church that ultimately Christians cannot forego the desire, eschatologically speaking, that the Jews will see Christ for who he is, as Paul clearly wants them to see? So in other words, are we not too driven by a kind of political correctness in relinquishing, this is the Jew saying that, in relinquishing what seems to be the core belief, or one of the core beliefs of the Jews? Well, it may also be a core belief that you shouldn't be nasty to the Jews. That's right. I love that. I love that. But on the other hand, are we going a little too far? Isn't Benedict reminding us that there is something still to be prayed for? What do you think of that?
Leave it in God's hands. I mean, that's my response, and I think that's a response that grows actually out of the agonized reflection upon the Holocaust, right? And the idea that actually anti-Judaism did have something to do with this relative passivity of most Christians in the face of the deportation of their Jewish neighbors, right? That there is something in God's plan for the Jews that we don't understand, that is mysterious, and we do violence to that plan by explicitly acting toward the Jews as though they have the destiny of becoming Christian. The interesting thing about Paul's letter to the Romans, chapters 9 to 11, is that in those chapters there's no mention of Christ, there's no mention of baptism, there's of course no sense of church in our current sense, and that is given some. And this is not my specialty, but the theologians who study this believe that this is done on purpose. So there's a very light hand in Paul's letter to the Romans. And again, I urge you to think of the final words of chapter 11. As you say, this was an agonized reflection. Paul was not happy about this. Paul said that he had great sorrow in his heart. It's one of the most profound, eloquent passages in all of his writing. Precisely where he even offers to sacrifice himself for the sake of what we would call the conversion of the Jews. But he ends it with this notion that's echoed by Cardinal Kaspar, that we leave these matters in God's hands because we don't ultimately understand. So I think we Christians can pray for the Jews and their welfare, but I think that's as far as one needs to go. God knows what's best for humanity and for human welfare, without going that extra step. But of course, if Jews desire to become Christian, by all means. A free decision like that made by Cardinal Lustiger, John Österreicher, who can question that, right? That's the sovereignty of the individual. This is again me speaking, right? Who else is going to speak? But if you're finished with your questions, for me, maybe I can pose some questions for you. How about one thing that I wonder about, having approached this issue of Christian-Jewish relations over time, is you said. Interestingly, that philo-Semitism is not acceptable, and this is a view that I've read elsewhere as well. My characters were also very careful never to be described as philo-Semites. They thought that was unserious. They thought that that made them bad theologians. To be a philo-Semite was, Karl Thiemann thought, was unacceptable. However, they did arrive at this understanding that Jews as a people have a continuing covenant with God. Therefore, there's something special about them. We can at least say that God loves the Jews. Even that doesn't mean that we have to be prejudiced in their favor. Does that make sense? And there could be a view, a theological view, that God loves the Jews without that meaning that an individual Christian or non-Christian has to have a different attitude toward an individual Jew that he or she meets. But maybe I'm asking too much of you, but what is the Jewish idea about how non-Jews might look upon Judaism, should look upon Judaism? There's this idea of light to the nations that one hears, right? I mean, what is an appropriate way for Christians to look upon Jews? Big question.
Whoa. Whoa, it's actually several questions. One is about the Jews, the other one is about Judaism. So let me just remind myself and yourself of the agenda of Zionism, which developed at the height of anti-Semitism, the time of the Dreyfus Affair in France, when anti-Semitic parties were voted into parliaments all over Europe. It was the first big wave of anti-Semitism, which in a sense triggered Jewish nationalism. Christians had their nationalism, Jews had their nationalism. Because it was understood that nations are the normal way for human beings to organize themselves. And the emphasis on the word of normal. The original idea of Zionism was to return the Jews to a normal existence of a people. The Zionists said, you're right, we're not a religion, we're a people, and to be a normal people we have to have our own political independence. And that's the only way to end anti-Semitism is by saying, okay, we'll have our own state, we have our own nation somewhere. It could be Argentina, it could be, well, preferred in the ancient land of the Jews, the land of Israel. The goal of Zionism was normalization. So how are Jews supposed to look how are Christians supposed to look at Jews? As a normal people, with its flaws, with its good individuals and its bad individuals, and don't judge us as in any way special or different from other people. We're just a normal people. We're not the special people. We don't represent Christian doctrine. We don't represent a special divine dispensation. We don't represent humanity as a whole, as Hildebrand, for example. Hildebrand tries to elevate the Jews, not religiously, but spiritually as an extraordinary people, the people of Moses, of David. Well, if you go around and look at the Jews, they don't all look like Moses and David. They don't act like Moses and David. They aren't Moses and David. Maybe they're Moses and David, but they're not the Moses and the David. So Jews just want to be looked at as everybody else, as normal people. Don't make us into anything special. That's the one thing. Now, what about Judaism? The answer is simple. Join us and study. The only way to learn about Judaism is to study it. Let's study together. Let's take our classes. Take a class with Michael Sattler over there. Come to Providence College and take classes on Judaism. If you offer, do you offer classes on Judaism? We did it one time. Okay. So offer a few more classes on Judaism. Study Scripture together. Study Talmud together. Study Jewish history. Look at what Judaism actually is, as a religious practice, as a faith. As a collection of different ways of responding to the same text that Christians are responding to. So that's the answer to that. Study.
You mentioned as a particular issue, this issue of romantic nationalism. Do you see Zionism as a form of romantic nationalism? Just as a follow-up on what you...
Can you switch off the camera? No comment.
No comment. Okay.
The question was, do I regard Zionism as romantic nationalism? It may have started as romantic nationalism and had some of its features. It was a political movement and an actual movement towards attaining certain political goals, at which point it became more than romantic nationalism, namely it became a political movement with its own factions and differences of opinion. Tomorrow at Boston University we'll have a discussion on the question of the religious roots of Zionism. There are religious roots to Zionism, and there are also religious and romantic dangers to what Zionism may be for some people today and may still be in the future. I'm not saying that the Jews are inured to the temptations of nationalism. Nationalism is a very tempting, very powerful ideology, and it may damage us as well. We are not, again, we are normal people. So we also have to be careful with our own nationalism.
Should we open it up?
Yeah, I think maybe time. We've got microphones either side. So we have maybe about 15, 20 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Is this
I have a question. Dr. Connolly, you mentioned the Good Friday service, and the prayer still is a little bit ambiguous that the Jews come to the fullness of salvation. But I'm more concerned with the gospel we read at that Mass, the gospel of the Passion according to John. A couple of years ago in our missalette, there was actually a note trying to explain it as not being anti-Semitic and saying that the word Jews in it did not refer to all the Jews. Are we embarrassed by the gospel of the account of John, of the Passion? Because he does seem to say, I'm not sure if the translation is right. I still find it somewhat a difficult Passion account that he says in there.
Well, I recommend reading Daniel Harrington on this. Daniel Harrington is actually recently deceased member of the Boston College theology faculty. He wrote several volumes about reading the Gospels, but I think also reading some of the epistles in light of the teachings of Vatican II. And he's actually one of the foremost Catholic specialists on the Bible of the last half century, I would say. Really a brilliant, learned man. And he will explain the historical context for the wording that is used in John and Matthew and the other Gospels, but also in Acts of the Apostles, where there's some very disturbing fragments. I think if read in the light of current theology, maybe I would even call it progressive theology, that one need not have the fear that one need be ashamed of the gospel, but one needs to inform oneself. But the argument there is historical, right? In other words, I'm not arguing now as a Catholic or and I'm not a theologian, but I think if one takes on board the theological research that was made possible in some ways by Vatican II, was unleashed by Vatican II, stimulated by Vatican II, then you know one will. And by the way, I think the missal was in that spirit. That is sometimes it's good that a missal will indicate that this wording may suggest one thing. In fact, it means something else. It has a historical context to it. I will say just one maybe editorial comment, which is that I think the Church could do more to look at and, I don't know if revise, but at least be aware of the masses of commentary on the Gospels that came out before the Council, so, you know, half century and earlier, that are full of this anti-Judaic teaching, where, for example, it is made to appear that the Jews have been abandoned. There's this, I think it's in Matthew, the parable of the vintners, where it's the evil vintners, and it was interpreted for many generations as meaning that the Jews have been deprived of their patrimony. And you know, if you read really anything from before 1962, that's what you get. So be careful in what you look at if you want to go. You know, if you want to find out more about these things. But I think Harrington is the place to start. An extraordinary scholar, really.
Good evening. I am a Catholic, as a matter of fact, a convert, but I ask my question as a philosopher, which I also am. I thought that both of you, but then I decided this is not true of Dr. Zonk, but it is true of Dr. Connolly, have frankly ditched the notion of truth. If Jesus is the Messiah, and I persuaded you, of course, fully respecting his freedom and not using nasty measures and all of that, which I fully agree with, to accept Jesus the Messiah, I've done him a favor. If Jesus is not the Messiah, then I ought to abandon him. The principle of excluded middle allows no medium ground. And if we ditch the notion of truth in the interest of politics, as many, many people are doing these days, we're going down a very, very nasty and dangerous road. And in fact, the Nazis are at the end of it.
Well, it's an excellent question. It's about pluralism, religious pluralism, right? And it's a strong argument because if we take politics, for example, let us say I'm a liberal or a Democrat, I can't therefore, if I really hold to my liberal beliefs, I can't believe that, say, a conservative's beliefs are also equally true, right? But where religion is concerned, maybe more delicacy is required. I happen to be married, I can speak of my own experience, to a non-Catholic. And, I tried when we first got together, I tried the more I have the truth and you need the truth approach. And it didn't work very well. But what I find works much better between us and for our children as well, I think all of whom I think are positively inclined to the Catholic faith, is that one lives out one's the thing that one can do with religion is one can attempt to witness to the truth and live the truth rather than simply preach the truth. And this is precisely, by the way, what Karl Thiemann said, interestingly enough, in the 1950s, at the time of conversion through, what did he say? Conversion or witness through word had run short. The time was to witness through deed. So I think that's more my approach.
Witness, however you think it looks good, and I'm really not in favor of that rural and God's style of preaching. But I mean, if you're witnessing to what you think is true, and there's no way around it. No matter
Correct. No, I don't think it's true.
Okay.
I do not say that.
Why don't we go to this side?
Thank you very much for your talks. And this picks up on the point John made, and Michael, that you were intrigued by it, that Jesus is Jewish. I have no idea whether this would simplify or complicate Jewish-Catholic dialogue, but from the medieval perspective, which is my area, one concomitant claim that goes along with that is that Christ fulfills the Torah, whereas Paul teaches that the Gentiles cannot and don't have to, that Christ does that. And one of the reasons they don't have to is that Christ does, in fact, did that, and I suppose, I'll defer to the other Thomist experts, continues to do that. Is that...
Christ does currently fulfill Torah.
Yeah.
But I mean, that includes, we have to unpack the word fulfill there. You might just start with Christ keeps Torah perfectly. That's a crucial medieval Christian belief. Christ keeps Torah perfectly. And that's absolutely essential to who he is and what he does. And it's lost in the modern view.
So as far as if Jesus being Jewish is of interest, then Jesus keeping Torah today, would that be of interest or complicate Jewish-Catholic discussions?
So it's impossible to hear this without thinking of Torah as a rabbinic, as rabbinic Torah. That is 613 commandments, written Torah and oral Torah. That is, Jesus puts on tefillin in the morning, and he keeps kosher in heaven. I mean, it's a nice idea, but that cannot possibly be what you have in mind when you think that Jesus fulfills the Torah. So the Christian understanding of Torah and the rabbinic Jewish understanding of Torah are two completely different things. They're not completely? Oh, okay. To fulfill, well, okay, so this is an interesting theological conversation we should have. It's a really interesting idea.
I want to thank you both for these talks, which were really wonderful. I want to pick up on something and push a little bit on what I think you were both talking about in different ways, though, and that's on the issue of dialogue. So Professor Zank, kind of talked, I think, very correctly about the asymmetry between kind of well, Judaism and Christianity and the place that they play in each other's stories, the asymmetry, of course, of the historical experience between Jews and Christians. And Professor Connolly kind of pulled on this issue of when Christians began to see what they were saying about Jews through the eyes of Jews, that was actually somewhat revelatory. And that really, I think, gets at the point of dialogue, right? Which is that the point of dialogue, at least from a Christian perspective, is to help Christians to see what they're saying about Jews through the eyes of Jews. But the asymmetry, I think raises this kind of critical point, which is what is in it for Jews, other than being seen by Christians? Is there a payoff in the dialogue, especially a theological dialogue, between Jews and Christians?
I would say the payoff is that you're being seen by Christians for what you are. That's a first. That's a payoff. It's worth engaging in dialogue because you can help others see what you think is really going on and what your perspective is on things, and I think that's a very enriching experience for both, and it may actually change the way we are seen. Well, that's an amazing achievement.
You do not see that, though, as itself asymmetrical.
Oh yeah, it is asymmetrical. There is well, yeah, okay, so what do you push? Okay, so he's pushing me to say, shouldn't therefore Jews also see Christians differently? Is that what you're saying? You're not sure. No, it's asymmetrical. I agree with you, it's asymmetrical.
But it goes beyond interreligious dialogue, intercultural dialogue, interethnic dialogue. All of these forms of communication are absolutely vital. That's why I always tell, there was a woman who was wanting to go to graduate school talking to me a couple of days ago, and I told her before she does any graduate student studies of European history, she has to live in Europe, and preferably in a couple of countries, just to find out the way other people think. I mean, it's the same kind. It's a very similar issue. I mean, it's not exactly the same issue, but it's related. Understanding the views of the other is enriching always, I think, and not to abandon one's own point of view, one's own sense of what is true, but to understand as deeply and as broadly as possible how other people come to differing conclusions. And by the way, it's we lack this, I think, politically currently in our own country. There's not enough really true dialogue, I think, across the political boundaries.
Yes,
But it's a broadly true.
Can I just add a footnote? It was not until I came to the United States that I began to see myself as a European.
Yes. This question may relate to the first speaker. I'm not sure of those passages he was referring to. But this is something that has, when I think about it, has bothered me for a long time. It was about 20 years ago. I'm Jewish, and it was about 20 years ago when I was in a church. It was a funeral of a co-worker's, I think his mother. In any case, as I was sitting there, just like I do in synagogue, I was also looking through the passages and reading. I mean, why not? And it happened to be around Easter time, and I knew about Vatican II, and yet, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because this was a long time ago, but what I was reading seemed to me, it definitely mentioned the Jews, and it seemed to me anti-Semitic, and I didn't know, I was just like really stunned, embarrassed, stunned, and afterwards, I never read it again, so I don't know exactly what it said, but considering that, I mean, obviously I have non-Jewish friends and I have non-Jewish relatives, was I interpreting right? And why is it there after Vatican II?
Now, of course, we don't know exactly what
Right.
it was you read, but somebody told the story this morning. That's a Jewish woman came to a church, went with somebody else, and then afterwards told her friends, said, do they realize how Hebraic they are? And she said, yes, they do, actually. I think the wonderment, the puzzlement, for the first time you encounter just how obsessed Christians are with Jews and how constantly engaged they are with the Jews in a way that they become a foil to the very gospel, you realize just how enmeshed these two communities really are. They can't let go of one another, especially the Christians can't go. You can't cross out every Jew in the New Testament. You're left with nothing.
Well,
right?
well, what's it
You're
saying
left with
about-
Gnosticism. That is just the issue.
Well, what's it saying about, and like I said, this was a long time ago, so maybe I interpreted it wrong, but I got the impression it was talking about the Jews killing Jesus. Am I wrong? Is that there? I'd like
Well,
to be wrong.
Yeah, I guess that's still in the New Testament.
Well, yes.
But in what you read when you go to church, is that, I'll ask Dr. Connolly, is that still there?
Well, I think that there have been ways of altering, I don't know, or differently translating, let's put it that way, parts of the Gospels where they will substitute now authorities for Jews. Earlier, or they'll say the crowd shouted rather than the Jews shouted. Apparently there are different ways of translating that. But I think that precisely the Jews killed Christ, and that with those words, probably not. But there are words that, if you're not familiar with it, it's not unusual for these words to seem disturbing. But that's why I would appeal precisely for illumination via people who really work on these issues. Sometimes expertise is really, really required, and people like, for example, Harrington are quite helpful. There is a body. What I find, again, interesting, and I think it's unremarked about Vatican II, is that it made possible for theologians to look upon these texts with different eyes and to become more aware where the problems are, and to ask themselves, is it possible to translate these in ways that are less bothersome, less demeaning?
Right, because I was concerned, like a layman, a Christian, go into church every week reading that, if my impression was correct.
Well, when I was growing up, I listened to went to church every Sunday. I heard it's a 3-year cycle, so you hear essentially much of the New Testament, most of the Gospels, and it never occurred to me to associate the people in the Gospel stories with Jews. Like we live next to the Glassmans, and in Philadelphia, there's a good mixture of different ethnic groups. It never occurred to me to associate what we were hearing in church with people living on my street. So. I realized that in history that has not been the case, particularly in Central Europe, which is the area that I study as a historian. That there were people who people would leave church on Good Friday and go attack Jews.
Right.
Happened all the time, but it's not a necessary reading of those texts in my view.
Thank you.
But the translation still says the Jews.
Depends again. You'd have to break it down by specific gospel and specific statement. In some cases, they've tried to. Yeah.
So we have, if I could just interject, I'm sorry, we have 2 people who've been waiting very patiently, and we only have about 5 more minutes left. So I do want to give these folks here a chance to ask their questions.
All right, Dr. Urbano, won't be too long, I suppose. But and I'm just an undergraduate, so if I'm, wrong, I'm wrong, I guess. But my understanding of Catholic dogma, just catechetically, is that you have the church on earth, the church militant, and non salva ex ecclesia. I might be saying the Latin wrong, but the idea, not necessarily that did occur. That was taught for a long time. Vatican II might have reprieved that or whatnot, and that still the common understanding is that sort of everybody's a Christian in heaven because you're enlightened with the truth. You see, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. You see Mary and Joseph, and you realize that, kind of the dogma of the church was kind of right all along, is ultimately what the church teaches. And you said, Dr. Connolly, in your talk that that in heaven, that Jews wouldn't become Christians in heaven, and that
I didn't say that.
I must have misinterpreted you. I'm sorry. But
No, I think what I said is that there's no necessity of believing that Jews become Christian at the end of time.
Okay.
And I think that's absolutely accurate theologically.
so
And furthermore, I don't believe that there's theological basis for saying anything about what heaven is like. There's nothing. You won't find anything in the New Testament that portrays for you existence in heaven. So this is precisely one of the issues which I believe one has to leave in the realm of mystery. Religion is about mystery. It's about our inability to touch ultimate truths, to comprehend them. So I wouldn't go. I would simply say I'm not a priest. I'm not a theologian. Talk to a good priest. But my own sense is that what you said is theologically not necessary.
So I assume that what you were referencing then is that Jews at the end of time, just as far as the way that sort of, were you trying to, I mean, I don't know history, obviously, as well as you do. Trying to infer that people prior to Vatican II were thinking that, like, Judaism shouldn't exist by the time that Christ comes?
Well, yeah, there were interpretations that basically mixed passages from Matthew, Revelation, and Romans. Interestingly enough, Romans 11, to suggest that before the end of time, the 12 tribes of Israel would bow to Christ, would recognize the Messiah, and that would somehow be connected with the end of time. It was almost a timetable that people thought. They thought that the Bible kind of gave us a schedule, the way that Amtrak gives you a schedule, you know. And I think now that is not the current understanding.
Okay. Thank you.
As a Protestant, I can add that Nostra Aetate also had a very profound impact on the insights and development of at least liberal Protestant thinking. But I think I go back to the original question, and I'm not sure you can answer it tonight, but is Nostra Aetate possible at the time it occurred without the Holocaust?
No, it's not. And it's a really excellent question. It's an extremely difficult question because you don't, when you read the bishops' discussions and the debates among the advisors, they're never explicitly talking about the events of the 1940s, but occasionally, in particular on the part of German bishops, the word Auschwitz will emerge. And what they'll say is, you know, after Auschwitz, we cannot remain silent on this issue. This, by the way, was John the 23rd's position, and he's the person to whom we thank for the council taking place at all. And it was after the intervention of a French Jew. I don't know if you're all familiar with this story, Jules Isaac, who was a survivor. He lost his wife and I think his daughter-in-law, members of his close family in France during the Holocaust. He was a historian, and he implored John the 23rd to include a statement about the Jews at the council. That's the beginning of the statement of the Jews. The interesting thing from the standpoint of Protestantism or other religions is that once the church then began working out a statement on the Jews, it felt it couldn't be silent in other religions. That's very interesting, actually, that talking about, you know, this supposedly one particular people caused the church to talk about all religions and to confront the issue of religious pluralism, also a problem of modernity, right? The fact that we live in societies that are not segregated, where the walls have been taken down. So but without the Holocaust, none of this happens. But again, it's not clear. The relation is difficult because if you look at Catholic journals like Commonweal, which I read and occasionally write for in this country in the 1950s, there's no discussion of the need to rethink Catholic-Jewish relations, nothing. It's true also Stimmen der Zeit and the French journals of this period. There's remorse about the crimes of Nazism and the like, but no sense that the church has any relation or role in those crimes. So it's almost we're in providential, right? We're in Providence, I can say that. It seems almost providential that this issue then emerged when it did, how it did.
Unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but I do want to, those of you who still have questions, perhaps our speakers may have some moments after the talk. But I do want to give my thanks to both Michael Zonk and John Connolly for our discussion tonight. And an important part of dialogue is talking about how we talk with one another. So thanks to them and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I just want to mention, if any of you still have a few moments, we have an exhibit in the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies, the entrance of which is here and down the stairs, called Remembering the Holocaust, Local Voices. And it features the photographs of a Dominican priest who was here at Providence College, who was an army chaplain and part of a battalion who liberated one of the concentration camps. And we have his photos as well as some student publication clippings of PC students from the 30s and the 40s reacting to events in Nazi Germany. And through these doors, down the stairs, and to the left. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you in the fall.